Arizona Territory, high summer, 1882. The trading post at Copper Springs sat like a scar on the desert floor, half-built structures clinging to existence where 3 trails crossed. Heat shimmered off the red earth in waves that made the horizon dance. Inside the largest tent, converted into a makeshift saloon, the air hung thick with sweat, tobacco smoke, and the particular stench of men who believed money made them gods. At the back of the tent, chained to a support beam, sat a woman with her head bowed. Her name was Margaret, though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in so long she sometimes forgot it belonged to her. 23 years old, though she looked older. Her cotton dress, once white, now bore the rust-colored stains of old blood and newer dirt. Her dark brown hair hung in matted tangles past her shoulders. Her hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the fabric at her knees. The chain around her neck was new, heavy iron that had rubbed the skin raw. Her wrists bore older scars, pale lines that spoke of previous restraints. She kept her green eyes fixed on the packed earth floor, watching ants march in determined lines toward crumbs of dropped bread. A man in a stained vest stood on an overturned crate, calling out to the gathered crowd of miners, drifters, and ranch hands. His voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone selling livestock. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen. Strong back, good teeth, young enough to give you years of service. She can cook, she can clean, and she's been properly broken to obedience." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she did not raise her head. She had learned that looking at them only made it worse. "Do I hear $20? 20 for a woman who'll work harder than any 3 Chinamen you could hire?" "She looks half dead already," someone called out. "Just needs feeding up," the seller countered. "Nothing wrong with her that a few good meals won't fix. Besides, at this price, even if she only lasts you a season, you're getting your money's worth." Laughter rippled through the tent. Margaret felt the heat of their stares, the weight of their appraisal. She had been through this before, in other places, with other men. Each time, she promised herself she would find a way to die before the next auction. Each time, she survived anyway, if only out of spite. 15, a voice rasped from the back. 15. "Come now, gentlemen, she's worth more than a decent horse." "Then sell her to someone who needs a horse," the same voice replied. Margaret risked a glance upward. The speaker was an old prospector with skin like leather and eyes rheumy with drink. She looked away quickly. 20, another man called, younger, with the cruel smile of someone who enjoyed breaking things. 25, from a broad-shouldered miner with dirt under his nails and violence in his stance. The price climbed slowly. Margaret's breathing grew shallow. She knew what came after the auction. She had the scars to prove it. $30, the young man said, and the room quieted. $30 was real money, more than most of these men saw in a month. The seller grinned. $30. Going once. Going twice. 50. The word cut through the thick air like a knife through canvas. Every head turned. The man who spoke stood in the entrance to the tent, silhouetted against the brutal afternoon sun. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a build that suggested strength earned through hard work rather than violence. He wore a brown work shirt, canvas trousers held up with leather suspenders, and boots covered in red dust. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but Margaret could see the line of his jaw, set hard, and the way his hands hung loose at his sides, ready but not threatening. $50, he repeated, stepping into the tent. His voice was deep, steady, with the flat accent of someone who had grown up in these territories. The seller blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, that's more than generous, but I should tell you, she's been through several owners. Tendency to run, if you take my meaning. Not properly grateful for." "I heard you the first time," the man interrupted. $50. "Take it or I walk, and I'll make sure every man in this tent knows you turned down $50 because you wanted to brag about breaking a woman's spirit." Silence fell heavy. The other bidders shifted uncomfortably. There was something in the stranger's tone that suggested he was not a man to cross. The seller cleared his throat. Sold. $50 to the gentleman. The tall man pulled a leather pouch from his belt and counted out coins with deliberate precision, stacking them on the seller's makeshift table. Real silver dollars, not scrip or promises. He turned to Margaret then, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors, brown eyes that held something she could not quite name, and a thin scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. His hair, dark brown and longer than was fashionable, curled slightly at his collar. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate, giving her time to see him coming. When he reached the beam, he crouched down to her level, not looming over her. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her alone. "I'm going to unlock this chain now. I won't touch you unless you need help standing. Do you understand?" Margaret stared at him, searching for the lie, the trick, the trap. She found none, only a steady patience. She managed a small nod. Thomas produced a key he must have gotten from the cellar. The lock clicked open, and the chain fell away with a sound like breaking glass. Margaret's hand went immediately to her throat, touching the raw skin there. "Can you stand?" Thomas asked. She pushed herself up, legs trembling. Thomas rose with her, staying close enough to catch her if she fell, but true to his word, he did not touch her. "I have a wagon outside," he said. "It's about a 2-hour ride to my ranch. There's water and food if you want it. If you don't, that's fine too." Margaret's voice came out rough, amused. "Why? Why what? Why did you?" She gestured vaguely at the tent, the crowd, everything. Thomas met her eyes. "Because no person should be sold like they're not a person." He turned and began walking toward the entrance. After a moment, Margaret followed. She had nowhere else to go, and some part of her, the part that still remembered being human, wanted to believe him. The men in the tent parted as they passed. No one spoke. No one stopped them. Outside, the sun hit like a physical blow. Margaret raised one scarred hand to shield her eyes. Thomas's wagon waited in the shade of a scraggly cottonwood tree, hitched to 2 sturdy draft horses. The wagon bed held supplies, tools, sacks of grain, nothing threatening. Thomas pulled himself up onto the bench and offered his hand down. Margaret ignored it, climbing up on her own with difficulty. He did not comment, simply picked up the reins. "There's a canteen behind you," he said. "And some dried meat wrapped in cloth. Take what you want." The wagon lurched into motion. Margaret gripped the edge of the bench, watching the trading post recede behind them. She waited for Thomas to speak again, to explain what he expected, what he wanted. But he remained silent, eyes on the trail ahead, seemingly content to let her be. After 20 minutes, she reached for the canteen. The water was warm but clean. She drank deeply, feeling it settle in her empty stomach. She did not touch the food. Not yet. She had learned to be cautious about accepting things from men. The landscape rolled past in waves of red earth and scrub brush. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels on distant ridges. The heat pressed down from above and radiated up from below, turning the world into an oven. Thomas drove with the ease of someone who had made this journey countless times. Occasionally, he would point to something, a particular rock formation, a hawk circling overhead, and name it quietly, not expecting response. Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye. His hands on the reins were competent but not harsh. His profile showed concentration but not anger. He had rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with the various scars of ranch work. "What do you do?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. Thomas glanced at her. "I raise cattle." Have about 200 head right now, though I'm looking to expand. Got some horses too, and I'm trying my hand at growing vegetables that won't die in this heat. Alone? I have 2 hands who work for me, Paulo and his son Miguel. Good men. They live in the bunkhouse on the far side of the property. He paused. They're expecting me to come back with supplies, not, well. They might be surprised. But they'll be respectful. And if I run? Thomas kept his eyes on the trail. Then you run. I paid $50 because I thought you deserved not to be chained to a tent pole. I didn't buy ownership of your choices. Margaret processed this. What do you want from me? Right now? Nothing. When we get to the ranch, I'll show you to the guest cabin. It locks from the inside. There's a bed, a stove, basic supplies. You can stay there as long as you need. He paused. If, later, you decide you want to help around the ranch, we can discuss wages. If you decide you want to leave, I'll give you money for the journey and point you toward the nearest town where you can make a fresh start. Why would you do that? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. My sister was 19 when she was taken by Comancheros. We looked for her for 3 years. When we finally found her. He stopped, swallowed. When we found her, she was not the girl who'd been taken. She was something those men had made her into. She lived another 2 years, but she was never the same. Never felt safe again. Margaret's throat tightened. I'm sorry. So am I. Every day. Thomas adjusted his grip on the reins. I can't undo what was done to you. I can't give you back whatever you lost. But I can give you a place to rest without fear. If that's worth something to you, it's yours. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different quality of silence. Less wary, less brittle. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when the ranch came into view. It was modest but well-maintained, a main house built of adobe with a covered porch, a large barn painted red against the elements, several smaller outbuildings, and 2 corrals where horses moved lazily in the heat. Vegetable gardens stretched along the south side of the house, protected by cloth screens. Everything spoke of care and attention. Thomas drove the wagon past the main house to a small cabin set back among a stand of mesquite trees. It was simple, 4 walls and a roof, but the door was solid and the windows had real glass. This is it, he said, climbing down. He went to the back of the wagon and pulled out a wooden crate. I'll bring this inside and then leave you alone. Margaret followed him to the door. Inside, the cabin was clean and spare. A bed with a simple frame stood against one wall, made up with faded but clean quilts. A small cast-iron stove occupied the corner, a table and 2 chairs sat beneath the window, and a trunk waited at the foot of the bed. Thomas set the crate on the table. Bacon, beans, coffee, bread. Some vegetables from the garden. Should last you a few days. He walked to the trunk and opened it. Shirts, trousers, a dress, all clean. My sister's things. They've been packed away for 5 years, but I wash them every spring. Thought someday they might be useful to someone. He straightened and moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. I'll come by in the morning with fresh water and more food. If you need anything before then, the main house is the building with the red door. Don't hesitate. Thank you, Margaret said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Thomas nodded and left, pulling the door shut behind him. Margaret stood frozen for a long moment, listening to the sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth, fading into the distance. Then she moved to the door and found the lock, a simple bolt that slid into place from the inside. She engaged it, hearing the solid click with something like relief. She turned and surveyed her domain. It was small. It was sparse. It was hers. For the first time in 4 years, Margaret allowed herself to believe she might survive the night. She did not sleep that first night, despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. She sat on the bed, back against the wall, watching the door. Every sound made her tense, the settling of the cabin, the rustle of night creatures outside, the distant lowing of cattle. She waited for the knock, the demand, the violence. It never came. Dawn broke slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink visible through the small window. Birds began to sing, tentative at first, then growing bolder. Margaret watched the light change, realizing with something like wonder that she had made it through the night untouched. A knock came, soft but clear. Margaret's hand went instinctively to the knife she did not have. "It's Thomas," the voice came through the door. "I'm leaving fresh water and some breakfast outside. Take your time." She heard him set something down, then his footsteps retreating. Margaret waited another 10 minutes before unbolting the door and cracking it open. On the small porch sat a bucket of water with a ladle, a covered basket, and a towel. She pulled them inside quickly and bolted the door again. The basket held warm cornbread, hard-boiled eggs, and a small jar of honey. Real food, not scraps. Margaret ate slowly, forcing herself not to rush, to taste each bite. When had she last eaten something sweet? She could not remember. After eating, she poured water into the basin she found under the table and washed her face, her hands, her arms. The water turned gray with dirt. She washed again, then again, scrubbing at her skin until it was red but clean. She opened the trunk and found the clothes Thomas had mentioned. The dress was simple calico, faded blue with tiny white flowers. It looked like something a farm wife might wear for Sunday church. The trousers were canvas, practical and worn soft. The shirts were cotton, plain but serviceable. Margaret chose the trousers and a shirt, stripping off her ruined dress and leaving it in a heap on the floor. The clean clothes felt strange against her skin, too soft, too kind. She stood for a moment, running her hands down the fabric, allowing herself this small luxury. A week passed. Each morning, Thomas left food and water. Sometimes he knocked, sometimes he did not. Margaret never opened the door while he was there, but she began to listen for his footsteps, to anticipate his arrival. The consistency was strange, almost frightening in its reliability. On the 8th morning, she woke to the sound of rain, the first she had heard in months. She went to the window and watched water fall from the gray sky, turning the red earth dark and bringing up the scent of creosote. The rain felt like a blessing, a washing away. When Thomas came with breakfast, Margaret opened the door. He stood on the porch, hat in hand to keep the rain off his face, looking startled. "Morning," he said carefully. "Good morning." Margaret's voice was still rough, but stronger. "Thank you. For the food. For everything." "You're welcome." Thomas shifted his weight. "Rain's supposed to last another day or two. If you need anything, just let me know." Margaret nodded. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. "The cabin treats you well?" Thomas asked. "Yes. It's..." She searched for the word. "Peaceful." Something in Thomas's expression softened. "Good. That's good." He started to turn away, then paused. "If you want company sometime, just for a meal or conversation, you're welcome at the main house. No pressure. Just an offer." He left before Margaret could respond. She watched him walk through the rain toward the barn, shoulders hunched against the weather. For the first time, she considered the possibility that he meant exactly what he said, nothing more, nothing less. That evening, as the rain drummed on the roof, Margaret found herself restless. The cabin felt too small suddenly, too quiet. She thought about Thomas's offer. Company. Conversation. Normal human things she had not experienced in so long they felt like fairy tales. Before she could talk herself out of it, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, unbolted the door, and stepped out into the rain. The main house glowed with lamplight. Margaret crossed the muddy ground, her heart pounding. She raised her hand to knock, hesitated, then knocked anyway, 3 sharp raps. The door opened. Thomas stood there, surprise evident on his face. "Margaret. You said if I wanted company." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "I did. I meant it." He stepped aside. "Please, come in." The main house was larger than the cabin but still modest. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire burning despite the summer rain. The room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. It was clean but lived in, with books stacked on shelves, a worn armchair by the fire, and the lingering smell of coffee. "I was just about to have dinner," Thomas said. "Nothing fancy. Stew and bread. You're welcome to join me." Margaret nodded, finding herself unable to speak. They ate in awkward silence at first, the clink of spoons against bowls too loud. But gradually, Thomas began to talk, filling the space with stories about the ranch, about Paulo and Miguel, about a troublesome cow that kept breaking through fences. "She's clever," he said with a hint of humor. "Figures out the latches. I swear she's smarter than most people I know." Margaret found herself almost smiling. "What's her name?" "Houdini. After that magician who does the escape acts." Thomas took a bite of bread. "Miguel named her. He has a sense of humor about these things." "And your other cattle?" "Most don't have names. But there are a few characters. Old Bull, who thinks he runs the place. Daisy, who follows Paulo around like a dog. Trouble, who earned her name the day she was born by kicking the fence down." Margaret listened, letting his words wash over her. It was strange, this normalcy. Uncomfortable in its strangeness, but not unwelcome. "What about you?" Thomas asked carefully. "Where are you from?" "Originally, I mean." Margaret stiffened. Thomas noticed immediately. "Or don't answer," he said quickly. "I'm just making conversation. You don't owe me your story." But Margaret found herself wanting to speak, to be more than just the woman he had bought at an auction. "Missouri. A small town. My father had a farm." "Did you like farming?" "I liked the animals. The chickens especially. They were silly creatures, but honest in their silliness." Thomas smiled. "I know what you mean. Animals don't pretend to be something they're not." They talked until the fire burned low and the rain gentled to a steady patter. Margaret told him about her childhood, carefully editing out the parts that came later. Thomas talked about learning to ranch from his father, about the hard years after the war, about building this place from almost nothing. When Margaret finally rose to leave, she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. "Thank you," she said at the door. "For the meal. For the conversation." "Anytime," Thomas replied. "Truly." Margaret walked back through the rain to her cabin, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt less alone. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Margaret began to venture out during the day, exploring the ranch, watching Thomas and his workers tend the cattle. She met Paulo, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner, and Miguel, his teenage son who was learning the ranch work with enthusiasm. Both men treated her with careful respect, never pressing too close, always greeting her with polite nods. Miguel, especially, seemed to understand her need for space, often occupying himself with tasks that kept him at a distance until she grew more comfortable. One morning, Margaret found herself drawn to the vegetable garden. Thomas was there, on his knees in the dirt, checking the roots of tomato plants. "They're struggling in this heat," he explained when he noticed her. "I try to water them early, before the sun gets too high, but it's a constant battle." "You need shade," Margaret said without thinking. My father used to string canvas between poles. Let the sun through but not the worst of the heat. Thomas looked up at her. That's a good idea. I have canvas in the barn. Would you want to help me set it up? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. They worked together through the morning, Thomas digging post holes while Margaret cut and measured canvas. It was strange at first, working alongside him, but Thomas had a way of giving her space even when they were close, never crowding, never demanding. When they finished, the garden looked different, sheltered and protected. Thomas stood back, hands on his hips, surveying their work. That should help, he said with satisfaction. Thank you. You're welcome. Margaret wiped sweat from her forehead. I could, if you want, I could tend the garden. Not for pay or obligation. Just because I'd like to have something to do. Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. If you want to work, we'll discuss fair wages. I won't take your labor as charity. I'm not ready for wages, Margaret said quietly. Not ready to be employed. But I need to do something useful or I'll lose my mind in that cabin. Understanding crossed Thomas's face. All right. You tend the garden because you want to. When you're ready to talk about wages, for this or anything else, you let me know. From that day on, Margaret spent her mornings in the garden. She weeded and watered, planted new seeds, coaxed life from the reluctant earth. The work was hard, but it was good hard, the kind that left her muscles aching in a way that felt like accomplishment rather than punishment. She also began taking her evening meal at the main house several times a week. Thomas never asked why she came on some nights and not others. He simply welcomed her when she appeared and wished her well when she left. They talked about small things at first, the weather, the ranch, books Thomas had read. Gradually, the conversations deepened. Thomas told her about his sister, about the guilt he still carried for not finding her sooner. Margaret found herself sharing pieces of her own story, carefully at first, then with more openness. My husband died 5 years ago, she told him one evening. Fever took him in 3 days. We didn't have money for a doctor. After he was gone, I tried to keep the farm, but the bank. She trailed off. They took everything. I had nowhere to go, no family. I started working wherever I could find it. But work for women in my position, it's limited. Thomas listened without interrupting. A man in Kansas City offered me a job as a housekeeper, Margaret continued. Promised room and board, decent wages. When I got there, She stopped, swallowed. He had different expectations. When I refused, he sold my papers to a trader. Said I owed him for the travel expenses, for the food I'd eaten. After that, I was just property. Passed from one owner to another. Some were worse than others. None were good. I'm sorry, Thomas said quietly. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry people can be so cruel. Margaret met his eyes. Why aren't you? Cruel, I mean. You could have done anything after you bought me. I wouldn't have been able to stop you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Because cruelty is a choice, same as kindness. And I saw enough cruelty during the war to last a lifetime. When I came back, I decided I wanted to be the kind of man who made things better, even in small ways. Not always successful at it, but I try. You are, Margaret said. Better, I mean. You're a good man, Thomas Garrett. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding. Thomas reached across the table slowly, giving her time to move away. When she did not, he gently placed his hand over hers. His skin was warm, calloused from work. Margaret looked down at their joined hands and felt something crack inside her, not breaking but opening. Summer deepened into its hottest months. The days shimmered with heat, and the nights brought little relief. Margaret's garden thrived under her care, producing vegetables that supplemented the ranch's supplies. She found herself taking on other tasks, mending clothes, helping Paolo with the horses, even attempting to bake bread with Thomas's guidance. The work gave her days structure and her nights peace. She slept better now, though nightmares still came sometimes. On those nights, she would wake to find a lamp burning on the porch of the main house, visible from her cabin window. Thomas never said anything about it, but she understood the message: she was not alone. One afternoon, as Margaret picked tomatoes in the garden, a wagon rattled up the road to the ranch. She tensed, old instincts flaring. Thomas emerged from the barn and walked to meet the visitor, a portly man in a merchant's suit. Margaret could not hear their conversation, but she watched the way Thomas's body language changed, growing tense and protective. The merchant gestured toward the garden, toward her. Thomas shook his head sharply. The conversation grew heated. The merchant pulled papers from his coat. Thomas looked at them, then tore them in half. "She is not property," his voice carried across the yard. "Not anymore. Not ever. If you come back here with more papers, with more claims, I will make sure every ranch between here and California knows what kind of man you are. Now get off my land." The merchant sputtered protests, but Thomas's hand moved to his hip, where his revolver rested. The merchant climbed back into his wagon and left in a cloud of dust. Thomas stood watching until the wagon disappeared, then turned and caught Margaret's eye. He walked over to the garden, his expression grim. "He was a traitor," Thomas said without preamble. "Claimed he had papers showing you were indentured to him for 3 more years. Wanted me to turn you over or pay him $200. Margaret's blood went cold. "What did you do?" "I told him the papers were fraudulent and that I'd make sure everyone in the territory knew he dealt in false contracts. He won't be back. And if he tells anyone else about you, I'll deal with that too." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Thomas said firmly. "I did." Margaret set down her basket and walked over to him. Standing close, she looked up at his face, at the hard set of his jaw and the concern in his eyes. "Why?" she asked again, the same question that had haunted her since the day he bought her. "Because you deserve to be free," Thomas said simply. "Because I—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then continued. "Because I care about what happens to you, Margaret. Not because I own you or because you owe me anything. Just because I do." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. "I care about you too," she admitted, the words feeling dangerous and right all at once. Thomas lifted his hand slowly and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. "I want to court you," he said. "Properly. The way you deserve. But only if you want that too. And only when you're ready." Margaret leaned into his touch, letting herself feel safe in a way she had not in years. "I might never be completely ready," she said honestly. "There are things that were done to me that I can't forget. Scars that won't heal." "I know," Thomas said. "I have scars too. Different ones, but they're there. We all carry something. And that's enough for you? Someone broken? You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference." His hand cupped her face gently. "And yes, Margaret, you're enough. More than enough." She reached up and placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. "Then yes. Court me. Take your time. Let me take mine. And we'll see what happens." Thomas smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "I can work with that." That evening, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the desert. Thomas had brought out 2 chairs and placed them far enough apart to be proper but close enough to feel companionable. "What's your favorite color?" he asked suddenly. Margaret blinked at the unexpected question. "What? Your favorite color?" "I realized I don't know it." "Why does that matter?" Because it's the kind of thing people who are courting should know about each other. All the small details that make up who you are. Margaret considered. Blue. The blue of the sky right after dawn, when it's clear and full of promise. That's a good blue, Thomas agreed. He pointed to a star just appearing on the horizon. That one there, that's Venus. The evening star. It's actually a planet, did you know that? No. Tell me about it. And he did, sharing stories about the stars and planets, about the way sailors used them to navigate, about ancient myths. Margaret listened, watching his face animate with enthusiasm, and felt something warm settle in her chest. Hope, she realized. That was what this feeling was. Hope for a future she had thought lost forever. Autumn came slowly to the Arizona territory, more a change in the quality of light than in temperature. The brutal heat eased to merely oppressive, and occasional rains turned the desert briefly green. Margaret's garden exploded with late-season vegetables, more than the ranch could use. We should take the excess to town, Thomas suggested. Trade them for supplies. Margaret tensed. The trading post? No. Tucson. It's a proper town, 2 days' ride. I need to go anyway to pick up some equipment I ordered. You could come with me, if you wanted. Or you could stay here. Paulo and Miguel will be around. Margaret thought about it. The idea of leaving the ranch frightened her, but staying behind while Thomas was gone frightened her more. And some part of her wanted to prove to herself that she could face the world again. I'll come, she said. They left before dawn, the wagon loaded with vegetables and goods to trade. The journey took them through desert and over low mountains, past the occasional ranch or mine. Thomas kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling stories. They camped the first night under the stars. Thomas set up 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, respecting the boundaries that still existed between them. Margaret lay awake for a long time, listening to the crackle of flames and the distant yip of coyotes, aware of Thomas's breathing across the fire. You awake? She asked quietly. Yeah. Thank you. For giving me a choice. About coming with you, I mean. You always have a choice, Margaret. Always. They reached Tucson late the next afternoon. The town was bigger than Margaret had expected, with real streets and buildings, churches and shops. People moved with purpose, conducting business, living their lives. Thomas found a respectable boarding house and paid for 2 rooms. I'll stable the horses and sell the vegetables, he said. You rest. Tomorrow we can explore the town together, if you want. That night, alone in a rented room with a door that locked, Margaret thought about how far she had come. From a tent in Copper Springs to a real bed in a real town, a free woman. It seemed impossible, and yet here she was. The next day, Thomas kept his word. They walked through Tucson together, Thomas introducing her as Miss Margaret Kane, her maiden name which she had not used in years. He bought her a new dress from a shop, soft green cotton that fit properly. He bought her sturdy boots. He bought her a silver hair comb in the shape of a flower. You don't have to do this, Margaret protested. I know. I want to. Thomas's expression was earnest. Let me do this for you. Please. That evening, they ate dinner at a small restaurant, sitting across from each other at a table with a white cloth and real silverware. Other couples dined around them, normal people living normal lives. For the first time, Margaret felt like she might be one of them. Thomas, she said as they finished their meal. I need to tell you something. He set down his fork, giving her his full attention. Before you found me, there were men. Not by choice, but still. She struggled to find the words. They used me. I don't know if I can ever be a proper wife. I don't know if I can. I don't know what I can give you. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. Margaret, I'm not courting you because I expect anything from you. I'm courting you because I love you. If all you ever want is to be my friend and live in that cabin and tend your garden, that's enough. If someday you want more, we'll figure it out together. There's no rush, no pressure, no expectations. Just us, taking each day as it comes. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. How can you be so patient? Because you're worth waiting for. Because what we're building, it's worth doing right. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. Not unless you want me to. Margaret wiped her eyes with her free hand. I don't want you to go anywhere. Then I won't. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, the wagon lighter but Margaret's heart somehow fuller. The familiar sight of the buildings, the mountains in the distance, the way the light hit the adobe walls, it all felt like coming home. Winter arrived, such as it was in the Arizona Territory. The nights grew cold enough for frost, and the days became crisp and clear. Margaret moved through her tasks with increasing confidence, no longer jumping at shadows, no longer watching the road for danger. She and Thomas fell into a comfortable rhythm. They ate dinner together most nights, sometimes at the main house, sometimes at her cabin which she had begun to make her own with curtains sewn from fabric Thomas bought in Tucson and a small shelf for the books he lent her. On Christmas Eve, Thomas knocked on her door with a package wrapped in brown paper. I know we haven't talked about celebrating, he said, almost shy. But I wanted to give you something. Inside the paper was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting, and a fine pen. I thought you might want to write, Thomas explained. Your thoughts, your memories, whatever you want. Something that's just yours. Margaret ran her fingers over the smooth leather. It's beautiful. But I didn't get you anything. You being here is enough of a gift. Margaret looked up at him, this man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, who had given her space to heal and time to grow. She stepped forward, rose on her toes, and kissed his cheek. Thomas went very still. When she pulled back, his eyes were bright. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Spring came again, bringing with it new green growth and the promise of warmer days. Margaret marked the passage of time not in calendar dates but in personal victories. The first day she rode a horse without fear. The first time she laughed freely at one of Miguel's jokes. The first morning she woke without nightmares. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas said, I need to hire more hands. The ranch is growing, and Paulo isn't getting any younger. I was thinking of posting notices in Tucson and Phoenix. That makes sense, Margaret said. I wanted to ask you something, though. Thomas turned to face her. Would you be willing to help interview them? You have good instincts about people. I trust your judgment. Margaret felt a surge of warmth at his words. A year ago, she had been property, without voice or value. Now Thomas was asking her opinion, trusting her judgment. I'd be honored, she said. Over the following weeks, several men came to interview for the ranch hand positions. Margaret sat with Thomas as they spoke to each candidate, asking questions, observing behavior. She noticed things, the way one man looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, the way another could not meet her eyes out of what seemed like shyness rather than disrespect. They hired 2 men, both older cowboys who treated Margaret with the same courtesy they showed Thomas. The ranch continued to grow, and with it, Margaret's sense of belonging. One warm spring evening, Thomas found Margaret in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as she planted seeds for summer vegetables. He crouched beside her, silent for a moment. I love you, he said quietly. I know I've said it before, but I wanted to say it again. No expectations attached. Just the truth. Margaret sat back on her heels, looking at him. His face was sunburned, his hair needed cutting, dirt streaked his shirt from a day's work. He looked tired and real and completely sincere. I love you too, she said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. I didn't think I could anymore. Love someone, I mean. But you've been so patient, so kind. You've given me back myself, Thomas. How could I not love you for that? Not just for that, I hope, Thomas said with a slight smile. No. Not just for that. Margaret reached out and touched his face, letting her fingers trace the scar on his cheek. For who you are. For your goodness. For the way you see me as a person, not a thing to be used. Thomas turned his head and kissed her palm. Will you marry me, Margaret? Not now, not until you're ready. But someday? Will you be my wife? Margaret's breath caught. Marriage meant vulnerability, meant sharing a life completely. It meant trust on a level she had not been sure she could ever give again. But as she looked at Thomas, at the hope and love in his eyes, she found that she wanted to try. Yes, she said. Someday. When I'm ready. Yes. Thomas pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, Margaret let herself be held without fear. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and knew she was safe. Summer returned, completing the circle of seasons since Thomas had brought her to the ranch. Margaret woke one morning and realized she no longer thought of the cabin as a refuge but simply as home. She no longer watched the road for danger. She no longer slept with a knife under her pillow. She found Thomas in the barn, repairing a saddle. I'm ready, she said. He looked up, understanding immediately what she meant. You're sure? I'm sure. They were married on a Sunday in late June, in the small church in Tucson. Paulo and Miguel stood as witnesses, along with the few friends Thomas had made over the years. Margaret wore the green dress Thomas had bought her, and carried wildflowers picked from the desert. The ceremony was simple. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her husband, Margaret said yes without hesitation. When Thomas slipped a simple gold band on her finger, she felt its weight not as a shackle but as a promise. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife. Thomas carried her over the threshold of the main house, which would now be their home together. He set her down gently in the middle of the front room. We can take this as slow as you need, he said. Nothing has to change tonight or any night. But Margaret found that she wanted things to change. She wanted to claim this new life fully, to step into it without reservation. I'm not afraid, she said. Not anymore. Not with you. That night, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Thomas loved her with a gentleness that made her cry. He was patient when she tensed, understanding when she needed him to stop and breathe and remember where she was. And when it was over, he held her close and stroked her hair and told her she was beautiful, she was brave, she was his. Margaret slept that night in her husband's arms, and dreamed of gardens blooming in impossible places. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Margaret still had bad days, times when memories would surface and she would retreat into herself. But Thomas learned the signs, learned when to give her space and when to hold her close. And Margaret learned that healing was not a destination but a journey, with setbacks and victories both. The ranch prospered. Margaret took over the management of the household and the gardens, which grew to include not just vegetables but herbs and flowers. She learned to keep books, tracking expenses and income with careful precision. Thomas consulted her on all major decisions, valuing her opinion as he would a partner's. 2 years after their marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy and terror in equal measure. She thought of her first baby, the one that had been lost before it had even drawn its first breath, taken by men who saw it as inconvenient. Thomas sensed her fear. This is different, he told her, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. This child will be wanted, loved, protected. And you won't go through this alone. I'll be with you every step. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret was sick for months, and as her belly grew, old fears resurfaced. But Thomas was true to his word. He was there for every moment, bringing her water when she retched, rubbing her aching back, reading to her when she was too tired to move. On a clear autumn morning, Margaret went into labor. A midwife from Tucson had come to stay at the ranch for the last month, and she tended Margaret with capable hands. Thomas stayed at her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Margaret wept with relief and joy. "A girl," the midwife announced, placing the infant in Margaret's arms. Margaret looked down at her daughter, at the tiny fingers and the dark hair and the eyes that would someday be green like her own. "Sarah," she whispered. "Her name is Sarah." Thomas touched the baby's cheek with one finger, his expression full of wonder. "Hello, Sarah. Welcome home." Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful. Margaret marveled at how something so small could be so demanding, and yet she would not have changed it for anything. Sarah was proof that good things could come from pain, that new life could bloom even in the harshest soil. When Sarah was 6 months old, a woman appeared at the ranch gates. She was young, perhaps 20, with bruises on her face and terror in her eyes. She carried a small bundle of belongings and walked with the careful gait of someone in pain. Margaret answered the door when she knocked. "Please," the woman said. "I heard, someone in Tucson said there was a woman here who might help. I have nowhere else to go." Margaret saw herself in those frightened eyes, saw the same desperation she had once felt. She did not hesitate. "Come in," she said. "You're safe here." She brought the woman inside, sat her at the table, and made her tea. Thomas came in from the barn and understood immediately. He nodded to Margaret, a silent acknowledgement, and went to prepare the cabin where Margaret had once stayed. The woman's name was Elena. Her story was different in its details but the same in its essence: a man who had promised safety and delivered cruelty, a system that saw women as commodities, a series of escapes and recaptures that had left her broken and afraid. Margaret tended her wounds and listened to her story. She gave her clean clothes and a safe place to sleep. And over the following weeks, she showed Elena what Thomas had once shown her, that kindness existed, that not all people were cruel, that healing was possible. Elena was the first, but she was not the last. Word spread quietly through the underground networks of women helping women. The Garrett Ranch became known as a safe place, a refuge. Over the years, other women came, some staying for weeks, some for months, some eventually making lives nearby. Margaret never turned anyone away. She remembered too well what it felt like to have no hope, to believe that cruelty was all the world had to offer. If she could give these women what Thomas had given her, a chance to heal, to rest, to remember their own humanity, then she would. Thomas supported her fully, even as it meant sacrifices. They added buildings to the ranch, converted the old bunkhouse into dormitory-style housing, built a larger kitchen to feed their growing household. The ranch became part way station, part sanctuary, part home. Not everyone understood. Some neighbors muttered about the type of women the Garretts were harboring. A few refused to do business with them. But Thomas faced down the criticism with the same steady resolve he had shown that day in Copper Springs. "These are human beings," he would say. "They deserve dignity and respect, same as anyone." And most people, faced with Thomas Garrett's unwavering moral certainty, found themselves unable to argue. Sarah grew up surrounded by women healing from trauma, learning early that the world could be cruel but that kindness was a choice you could make every day. She was a serious child, thoughtful and compassionate, with her mother's green eyes and her father's steady nature. On Sarah's 5th birthday, as Margaret watched her daughter play with the other children on the ranch, she felt Thomas's arm slip around her waist. "You've built something remarkable here," he said quietly. "We've built it," Margaret corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Maybe. But it was your vision, your heart." Thomas kissed her temple. "I'm proud of you, Margaret. Proud of who you've become." Margaret leaned against him, watching the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She thought about the woman she had been, kneeling in that tent in Copper Springs, and the woman she was now, standing on her own land with her husband beside her and her daughter's laughter ringing in her ears. "I'm proud of me too," she said softly. The years continued to pass, each one adding its own layer to the story of the Garrett Ranch. Margaret's hair began to show threads of silver. Thomas's face grew more lined, though he remained strong and capable. Sarah grew into a young woman who understood the value of compassion and the importance of fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. The ranch became legendary in its quiet way, known throughout the territory as a place of refuge. Local churches began to direct women there. Even some lawmen, the good ones who understood that legal did not always mean right, would quietly suggest the Garrett Ranch to women in desperate situations. Margaret kept a journal, as Thomas had suggested all those years ago. In it, she wrote the stories of the women who came through, preserving their names and their struggles so they would not be forgotten. She wrote her own story too, facing the painful memories and setting them down on paper where they could be contained, examined, and finally, released. One entry, written on the anniversary of the day Thomas had bought her freedom, read: "10 years ago today, I was sold at auction like cattle. I thought my life was over, that I would never again be anything more than property, a thing to be used and discarded. But a man with kind eyes and a good heart gave me something I thought I had lost forever, my humanity. Thomas did not save me because he wanted something from me. He saved me because he believed I deserved saving. And in doing so, he taught me that I could save myself. That I could take the broken pieces of who I had been and forge them into something new, something stronger. Now I stand on land I help manage, surrounded by women I help heal, raising a daughter who will never know what it means to be considered less than human. And I know that every woman who finds safety here is proof that one act of kindness can change the world. Not the whole world, perhaps. But one world. One life. And maybe that's enough." Margaret set down her pen and looked out the window. Thomas was teaching Sarah to rope, both of them laughing as the lasso missed its target again. In the distance, she could see 2 of their current residents hanging laundry, talking quietly in the warm afternoon sun. This was her life now. Not the one she had planned, not the one she had dreamed of in her girlhood. But it was hers, built from ashes and watered with tears and grown into something beautiful. Margaret closed her journal and went outside to join her family, stepping into the Arizona sunshine without fear, without shame, without anything but gratitude for the second chance she had been given and the life she had chosen to build with it. The desert bloomed around her, impossible flowers pushing up through unforgiving soil, proof that beauty could thrive anywhere if given half a chance. And Margaret Garrett, once Margaret Kane, once nothing but a number on a bill of sale, walked through that beauty with her head held high, free at last.